ask you, if people have got mobile phones, perhaps you might want to turn them off. I'll just remind you that this is going to be a technical session, okay, today. So we're going to, it's a technical deep dive. Hopefully no one's going to drown. We've got a few life rafts, here and there to get you up there. So it's going to be quite technical, and we're not going to, hold back too much on that. But we're going to try and pitch it at a level that hopefully everyone, will understand. Okay. There will be an opportunity, if we have that, to ask a couple of questions after each of the sections. But if we don't have that opportunity in the interest of time, we can take questions. We'll be here right the way through lunch, and the whole team is here today. Okay. I'll just remind you as well, if people do need a comfort break, unfortunately we're going to go right the way through to lunch. Okay, so we've got a lot to pack in. So there are facilities. The gentleman's very nice. There's a very nice marble urinal in there, which is quite famous, which we've got to look at. So that's up on the top floor. Unfortunately, this is an old society, an old building, so the ladies is unfortunately in the basement, so ladies, do be careful when you go down the stairs, and it's directly underneath the lecture theatre here. Okay, so we thought that for the agenda today, what we were going to cover is, I was going to give an introduction and a brief overview to the whole team here. And we have the whole exploration team, which is based down in Sevenoaks. We have another team over in Rabat, which is dealing with the execution and the drilling of the wells and all the operational sides of that, and also working with our partner Schlumberger on the development. But today we're going to focus purely on this exploration piece. Tim Marples is there, going to just follow, there's Tim there with an overview of the geophysical operations. Jason will run through the sedimentology, stratigraphy, and the basin model that you all heard about. The RNS, some figures relating to that, but actually that models are perhaps a lot more powerful than perhaps we indicated in the RNS, and there's some implications from that modelling work that Jason will share with you. We've also got here Roger White and Daniele Treboni, our seismic interpreters, and they are going to give you quite a lot of detail about the prospects and how they've unravelled the seismic and integrated all the work together to come up with our locations. And then Brian and myself will give you a little bit of an operational update and some of the concluding remarks. So some takeaways here that I want you to think about, during the day. So I think it's very important to realise that what we're dealing with here in Tendrara is really an extension of those prolific plays that are present in Algeria. Okay, but there are some differences of the Taghi, where we are in Tendrara, to that in Algeria, and we make no bones about that. So the Taghi is a lower quality rock. Okay. So the porosity of the Taghi in our area is about 6 to 12% on where we're targeted, and the permeability, that's the ability of the gas to flow out of that rock, is about less than 10 millidarcies. Across in Algeria, those rocks have higher porosity, 10 to 20%, and about 100 millidarcies of permeability. So they have ability to flow at commercial rates much easier across in Algeria. The real game opener, I believe, that Sound brought to this play and with the partners Schlumberger, was bringing on proving that this reservoir, this poor quality reservoir, can flow at commercial rates using more modern reservoir completion techniques, horizontal drilling and multi-stage stimulation. Okay, and that's quite important. So it's applying that new modern technology to that reservoir. Next thing I want to highlight through here is our new surveys, geological analysis that we've used to try and unlock and de-risk what we believe is really significant exploration potential through here, both in the Taghi but also in the deeper underlying Paleozoic. And from that, Jason's going to touch on and tell you a lot about the basin model, which is now much more robust. And we talk about some headline figures of 7, 20, 34 TCF, and that's what everyone anchors themselves on. But actually more important to us explorationists, what that basin model has given us is the timing of the charge relative to the formation of the traps, and Jason will come into that in some detail. Okay, we're looking at 500 million years of Earth history here. That's a lot of time for those source rocks to be generating hydrocarbons getting up the traps to the present day. It also gives us a sense of the migration pathways, which I think we used in the RNS as well. So the direction of which those hydrocarbons are migrating through the subsurface towards our traps. And lastly, Daniele and Roger They're going to go through into a lot more detail of this 3-well program. So all of these are pretty high impact wells. They're on, I know Wood Mac has mentioned these are one of the top 10 wells to watch in Africa at the moment. And what we're targeting there is some quite different material prospects in the Taggy and in the deeper Paleozoic, and we go through that in a bit more detail for you. So again, just to remind everyone, we always do this just to keep everyone, anchored at where we are. I know people have investments in other companies, but where are we in South? So we're up in the on the border between Algeria and Morocco. This is our acreage here. We mentioned it's 23,500 square kilometres, so that's a little bit larger than Wales. Okay. In fact, with the team and me earlier, we were looking at a geological map over here of the United Kingdom. Wales is through here, and if we want to take a cursory glance over this, you can see the complexity of the geology beneath that area and the variations that we have through there. So in all the work that we've done, there's still a lot more that we can do and uncover through here. Of course, we're also surrounded by a couple of super majors. So this is Sonatrach, which is the state oil company of Algeria, which is on the other side of our acreage to the east. And then we have Shell and Repsol have taken some acreage on an 8-year contract this year, right neighbouring to us here. And I'm aware that they're preparing perhaps for a 2D seismic survey. So we're a little bit ahead of the game on them in that regard. So we talked about the continuity or continuation of these prolific plays that we see in Algeria from the Elitsi, Gadames, right the way through into the high plateau. And one of the points I want to make with this slide and bring across is, there's been a tremendous amount of oil and gas discovered across that border in Algeria, 69 billion barrels. There's something like 3,000 or close to 3,000 exploration wells drilled up here. Very much explored, very much unlocked. On the high plateau there, between Morocco and Algeria, there's only 9 exploration wells been drilled in this area here. Now, why has really exploration been unsuccessful in Morocco on this area through here? And I like to liken this, it's fundamentally down to the geology, the tectonics of the region. This area of Morocco has enjoyed, if you will, or perhaps suffered, the alpine orogeny. And that's adding an additional complexity to the geology in this region. A lot of faulting, a lot of thrusting, a lot of folding, and a lot of uplift. And that's either exhumed or destroyed or complicated the petroleum systems which undoubtedly exist in Morocco. So a lot of the pre-existing exploration is resulting in quite small discoveries. But up here in the high atlas here on the high plateau, the reason why it's that high plateau up there is that there's a large stable piece of crust through there, and largely we believe that these petroleum systems have remained intact. So if I show you, this is a sketch of here, a cross section which runs from Algeria through here, up and across the border into Morocco, and across the Atlas Mountains through here with the high plateau in the middle. And this is from a reference, you can look it up in the library if anyone was really interested upstairs. A copy of this by Jonathan Craig, he's a very well known North African geologist. He works for ENI at the moment. And what I hope you can see here is the similarity of the geology in Algeria to that up on the high atlas. And I talked about this area being a stable fault block through here with a lot of the deformation partitions on the margin. So all the petroleum systems here are very much chopped up and faulted on either side. But because of this stable block in here, this accreted terrain we call it, they're very much protected. Bit of a squeeze, but largely intact. Throughout this next 2 hours, you'll hear quite a lot of terms of nomenclature. So one of them you'll hear is the word Hertzian unconformity, and that's this boundary through here, okay, that's highlighted in red. Okay, it's a major time gap, and the guys will be talking about it in a lot more detail later on, but it separates the underlying Paleozoic, where we have our source rocks and our reservoirs, from the overlying Mesozoic, where we have our Triassic and our salt, and our overlying Jurassic and Cretaceous carbonate sitting on top of that. So that's a very important surface running through there. Now, over the last 18 months, I think, since the team's been together and been working this is really a summary of all of the work that we've been doing. You can split it up, the exploration campaign that we've been managing here, into 4 main streams. So first of all, the geophysical surveys through here, or the geophysical reprocessing, what we've done is we've captured a lot of the historical data. So there's some 50 years of exploration data through here. The last seismic survey, I think, was undertaken in 1984, wasn't it, Tim? Something like that. And the earliest survey we got hold of is around about the late 60s. So a lot of that data actually benefited from being reprocessed, so we can try and improve the image on that. And all of that data has now been delivered to us, and Daniele has been interpreting that in parallel with that delivery. We've also reprocessed the smaller 3D data set that we have through here through pre-step time migration and pre-step depth migration. Tim will go into touch about that a little bit in detail, but I can take some more questions on that outside in lunch. We've also been focused on numerous geological studies in parallel here to try and address some of the critical risks with the reservoir, particularly that of reservoir quality. Okay, Jason will talk about that in a lot more detail. The stratigraphy and architecture of the reservoir. We've also been analysing gas samples, any source rocks that we can get our hands on. We've been doing a diagenetic study to try and understand the evolution and the complexity and the degradation of that reservoir quality. We've also looked at something called AFTA, or appetite fission track analysis. That's a technique that Jason has been using to understand what's happening in that time gap during the Hercynian unconformity to construct the basin model. Tim has very much been leading through here on the geophysical surveys, which included FTG, full tensor gravity, gradiometry, and new 2D seismic acquisition. So a lot of seismic. So I think it's one of the largest 2D seismic campaigns onshore at the moment in the world. It's about 2,850 line kilometres. So again, that's equivalent going from Land's End, John O'Groats, and all the way back again. So very large survey. It took about 9 to 10 months to complete. The first two phases of that have all been processed, fast track processing, all been interpreted, and as a result, we have the T9 and T10 wells.
Is that as good a focus as it can get?
The fast track? I'm saying that.
The screen, John.
Oh, the screen. Gary, can you try and focus the screen a bit more? Or? No, I think that might be as good as it gets. I think Gary will have another little go. I'll carry on talking. And lastly, of course, there's all the well planning piece. So the environmental and social impact assessment, all of the well planning, all done in parallel with this work through here. Mobilising the rig, which as you've seen on the tweets, currently mobilised at the moment. The pad's already built, a lot of the equipment is already in place, and we're preparing to drill, so we'll have results from this first well by the end of the year, hopefully before Christmas. So this is probably a very complicated slide, but if you're a geologist, you'll feel quite comfortable looking at this. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the nomenclature that we're going to be using through the talk and the concept of geological time. So I'll start over through the left through here. What we're looking at is about 500 million years of Earth history in Morocco, okay? We as geologists, split up this timeline through here into different eras. So the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic through here. So when we talk about the Paleozoic, we're talking about rocks that age from about 500 million years down to about 250 million years old. Okay, and this is just an idea of the sequences that we encounter, the different lithologies, the different rock types throughout time through there. So we split up our Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic into these different periods. So Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Okay, right way through there. So this is the sequence that we have up in Tendrara. We have a series of Paleozoic lithologies of rocks through here, which contain source rocks, and we talk about these petroleum elements of the petroleum system in a moment throughout there. And you also see that there are these gaps through here, and those are periods of erosion or misinsection through time, and those relate to different tectonic events, where the rocks can be reshaped, buried, uplifted, and structures and traps can form during those periods. Another very important time through here is obviously the Triassic and the Taggy, so that's the Taggy sandstone sitting in through there, and above the Taggy is our salt. The salt is a very important element to the petroleum system through here. We have it right the way across the Tendrara block, and it's a key element to the petroleum systems over in Algeria. So it's around about 80% of the oil and gas discovered in Algeria sits beneath this salt supercell. Okay, so 80%, that's 70 billion barrels over there. Above the salt through there, then you have your Jurassic and through to Cretaceous carbonates above. And you'll see some of these formations on the seismic lines that we'll show you later. Within the salt itself, there's a very important horizon through here, which is the Camp Flood Basalt, or the Dolerites, which Daniele may point you to on the seismic line. It's very hard rock, forms a very distinct acoustic boundary, very distinct reflector of the seismic, and enables us to map the structure over a wide area. This Camp Basalt here is the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. It was the largest outpouring of volcanism in the Earth's history. Covered an area of 11 million square kilometres, and that's the whole area, equivalent to the whole of North Africa. It's an enormous and a very important regional reflection event that we can map through there. So the important part for the petroleum systems is we need to have source rocks through here. So those are organic rich source rocks capable of producing our hydrocarbons, our oil and gas, which migrates into our trap forming events through here, and our reservoirs, which are sealed and contained by our seals, with that salt superseal as being very, very important, preventing a lot of these hydrocarbons down here leaking and escaping to the surface. So on a seismic line, we can pick out some of those events, and we can see some of those events through there. So hopefully everyone can see the Hercynian conformity. So it lies around about here, and the dolerite is this very bright reflector through here. And the salt, the top of the salt is sitting through here, and all that through there are the Jurassic carbonates. All this section being here, this enormously thick section through there, that's all the Paleozoic. I'll just cheese a bit and put an interpretation on there for you, just to guide you a bit more. Hercynian unconformity through here, truncating these underlying Paleozoic reflectors through here. You can see a tremendous thickness of the Paleozoic beneath the upper Mesozoic section through there. Our reservoir sitting through here, and there's our salt supercell sitting over the whole of the lot there, hopefully retaining all those hydrocarbons generated in the Paleozoic in the underlying reservoirs. So at Sound, historically we've collected together. There's been a lot of work that's been done previously. There are an awful lot of concepts, leads, different prospects at both the Triassic Tangy level and also in the deeper Paleozoic. Okay, a lot of you would have seen this diagram before. They're really highlighting areas where we think there could be a hydrocarbon trap, and we would have focused on a lot of these, with our seismic and with our studies and interpretation work that we do. And all the time what we're trying to do is de-risk these through here and pick the best ones to target with our drill bit. And of course that's what we've been doing here, so I'll just give a quick summary of the seismic surveys through here. So what this map is showing is a map of the whole area, again 24,500 square kilometres, so that's all about our permits, Tendrara and Anahual mixed into one. The black lines through there are the old historical seismic, which we've reprocessed all of that to try and improve the imaging through there. The white lines, the new survey that we had, which had two main objectives: to provide some long regional lines and lines over this Anahual area to try and explore the deeper structure and give us a bit more of regional context in there. But then on top of that, we've also had a number of seismic lines that we've placed in, which have focused in on a number of those prospects and concepts to turn those into drillable prospects, and that's where we are today. So we have two drillable prospects at the moment, which is the A1 structure in here, which is in green, which is about 25 kilometres offset from the T5 Horstera, which is our main discovery in here. And then we have northeast Latvia stratigraphic trap in here, which is a much larger feature through here, which could hold significant volume, and that's the target of the T10 well. The next series of slides I'm going to show you cover this area through here, which is the phase 1 and phase 2 mapping, which Daniele will show you in a lot more detail. So let's zoom in on that area through there. And what you're looking at here, this is a map of the structure of the taggy surface in the subsurface. So the orange colours through here is a three-dimensional image of that surface, and we've coloured it by depth. So the orange and blue, that's about 3 kilometres below the surface. And the red through there at the top is about almost just under 2 kilometres below the surface. So that's our seismic line in here, and what Daniele and Roger will be doing is interpreting these seismic lines and building these maps, this image of the subsurface structure in there. I'll point out some elements in here, so you can see that a lot of the drilling is focused on this area here, which is the Tendrara High, and that really there's no drilling elsewhere. There's another high area through here, which is actually the A1 structure. We'll talk about that in detail. There's this large Paleozoic high sitting in here, where there's a hole in there where the taggy isn't present. It pinches out onto the edge of that high. Okay? And there's another interesting trap, which is northeast Lapgar, which sits up here, which Daniele will describe in a lot more detail. So in terms of the overall petroleum system, we have our source kitchen. So this is the same image at the top of the taggy, but now just looking a bit north. There's the T5 horse with all the wells sitting on it through here. That's the A1 structure, a very similar looking structure, about 25 kilometres to the west. These are the source kitchens where we buried our source rock sufficiently and deeply enough that those organic rich shales in the Paleozoic are going to be generating gas. That gas will start to migrate up and will collect in these traps basically by buoyancy. Okay, so it starts to migrate through the subsurface and collects in these traps if we have a seal sitting above them through there. They will continue to migrate, fill this, and then they will spill up into this area and continue up and maybe escape to the surface unless we can develop some other trapping geometry in here. We'll talk about that a bit later. The important point is though, is this Paleozoic high in here actually acts as a major focus for all of these hydrocarbons coming out of this source kitchen. So if you can develop a prospect sitting in here, and Roger will delve into this a lot more deeply, there could potentially be an enormous prize sitting in this area here. So it's a different, deeper play below this surface here in the tagging. So that's the introduction, give you a bit of a flavour of where to come. I'm getting the cut off through here, so I've run over a little bit of time through here. So I'll just introduce you to Tim. So Tim Marcus is the Seismic Operations Manager. I think we'll skip questions for this one, it's just the introduction. So Tim, if you want to go on and take over from here. I think Tim,
Good morning. Slight change of technology now, if I look at something like that. So while that warms up, good morning, my name's Tim Marples and I'm the your manager of geophysical operations for this piece of work. I haven't been as visible as the rest of the team over the last few months. I put that largely down to head down, bum up and getting the seismic actually shot in the field. So I'm going to talk about the geophysical program and how it impacts on work further down the workflow. So I'd like to sort of set out my stall for 3 takeaways for this. So if you get a flavour and an overview for what geophysical operations actually is in the field, both flown, on the ground, and also quite a lot of this work goes on in a computer shop in Tunbridge Wells, of all places. So we do have, even at the geophysical operations level, we have an integrated process. The other part I'd like to talk about is, or I'd like you to grasp, is that this is driven by a geophysical strategy that underlies the exploration strategy. So from the acquisition, it leads both into Daniele and Roger's work on processing the seismic and coming up with leads, but it also, the FTG has been really instrumental in empowering Jason's work, and I hope you'll see that this all pulls together. And then the third part is we've spent 18 months and quite a lot of time and quite a lot of money upgrading the database so that we now have a better understanding of it. So there's a few slides dedicated to sort of before and after. So they're the 3 things that I'd really like to come out of this. Hopefully this flips. Wow. Okay, so what geophysics is and what it isn't. So we measure fundamental physical properties in the field. In terms of seismic, that is, we measure a voltage and a position. In terms of FTG, we measure an acceleration. and a position. And that's all we do. Further physical properties are derived, and geology is interpreted from that. So I sometimes feel a bit of fraud being in here as a geophysicist in this august geological society, because we're a little more upstream than that. And then, since we see everything through the prism of Brexit these days, geophysics in the news, I was somewhat shocked to see that we are top of the list of shortage occupations. So the next person you see talking about geophysics may well have an outrageous accent. This is John's agenda slide. So I'm going to be covering really the operations. We'll start with the 2D seismic acquisition, and then I'll cover a bit in the processing and then back on the FTG, and that's intended to feed into the various pieces of my colleagues when they talk. So I would like to start with this video, which you have seen, I think, or it's on the website, but it's a nice sedate piece of work while I get my eye in. So this is scenes shot in Morocco. I think, just pausing it here, we're actually pretty proud that we got over 1 million exposure hours recorded without a lost time incident or an LTI. LTIs can be fairly minor when it comes to metrics within the industry, but really we're pretty pleased not to have anything that related to a personal injury at that level. So moving swiftly on. Western Geco operated this for us. You see the guys wandering across the desert. A little faster would have been good. That's our planning office. And we started off with a field scout. So if I pause there, we have this tendency to put all the metrics that we have in terms of maybe quantities that you understand. So 1.5 million driven kilometres is equivalent to driving one truck around the world 30 times around the circumference. So that's another of these as big as Wales metrics. So I managed to start that again. Maybe I should stop pausing. Sorry. What I don't know is how to speed it up. So I'll just keep talking. As John said, we recorded 2,850 kilometres of line, and all the way down the lines, every 12.5 metres is a vibration point, and every 3.125 metres we vary a gap. And then we vibrate along by the side of the receiver lines. So I'll go into some detail on the next slide. So hopefully this will now move forward. You can see the pad marks where they've shot, and some of the lines are nice and straight. Others are a little more rugose than that. So these are the world's biggest vibrators at 80,000 pounds, and they were imported specially for us by Western Geco. You can see some of the exploration team out there. And it gets cold. And if those of you are coming out in next month, pack some thermals. It's going to get very cold at night, even in October. Big thanks to Shearwater for the fast track processing, without which we couldn't have turned this round fast enough. And proudly stood by the peg in the ground before, within the next month or so, we'll have that. The derrick will be upright for those of you who watch the feed on the website, and we'll be good to go. So a quick slide on the seismic method. So obviously the vibrator shakes. It shakes a sweep of sinusoidal waveform for about 24 seconds. That penetrates the ground and comes back to the receiver, so what I call the GAC, which is a geophone accelerometer. And the GAC digitizes the signal. It then sends that digitized signal down a cable, almost like a telephone line, to the recorder. In the recorder, the signal gets correlated, and correlation is effectively a process that takes that long 24-second sweep and compresses it into a spike, and the spike is analogous to a dynamite or an air gun pulse, which is how this methodology started in the first place. So I also put it in terms of ultrasound. So ultrasound and seismic are actually exactly the same. The only way they the only difference between the two is in scale. So while we record that offset up to about 8 kilometers, depending on where we are in the Earth, and we're expecting a penetration of 5 to 6 kilometers in commercial work and up to 20 kilometers in imaging with MOHO for academic work. In ultrasound, obviously, it's centimeter work. So the probe itself is probably about that size. For those of you who've ever had ultrasound, and they just pass it over, in this case, a kidney. So everybody was wondering which part of a baby it was. That's actually a kidney. And the other main difference is the frequencies involved. So in seismic, it's usually 0 to about 100, maybe 200 hertz, and very high frequency, or very shallow, high resolution areas. In ultrasound, we're in the 2.5 to 15 megahertz range, so of the order of 100,000 times higher in frequency. And for some sort of calibration, human hearing usually tops out at 20,000 hertz. So I think most of us has probably dropped off a little bit from that in the intervening years. So that's the seismic image. If you think of it in terms, the other analogy is optics, and it's the ray paths are going to pass through the Earth. At every Earth interface, you get a refraction, the rays bend, and inverting that problem is about how we generate images. I believe there was a question earlier about when in the future will we be able to create a perfect image from seismic. I think there is actually a research strand that's been going on for about 10 years, and the difference really is when we acquire seismic, we're looking for a reflection, which means if most of the energy goes straight down and is reflected, we treat it as signal. Unfortunately, in areas like Morocco, some of the energy comes squirting out sideways, and although it's coherent, it's treated as noise. The methodology for using all that noise or coherent energy is called full waveform inversion, and there are lots and lots of academic research groups working on that, and really it turns into what is already a big number problem into a huge number problem. It's all about compute. So I would imagine over the next, I would have thought actually over the previous 10 years, but actually I would imagine over the next 10 years, full waveform inversion will allow us to use what's currently noise and use it as signal. So moving swiftly on. This is really a very busy diagram, but what it will show is in terms of the probe for ultrasound, which is about this big, we use different receiver arrays from the very small to the very large. So these are about 10 meters apart, and we're talking from a 12 meter to a 25 by 25 meter array. So that's how we vary this in the field. So some quick pictures. This is the recording truck. Inside this is a large processing system, multi-node array. Again, the vibrators in the cold. These guys are positioning the gaps and injecting the XYZ location from GPS into them so that the system knows where everything is in space. So at any point in time, it's recording on up to 6,000 units, and it knows where everyone is. These are called mobile positioning and test systems, which is MPTS. So inevitably these guys have been known as the Muppets. It's a bit unfortunate for such a technical discipline. The somewhat contentious phasing. So those of you who've been following seismic over the course of the project we have the phasing here. So we started off in the green and moved through the pink, orange, light blue and yellow. So that's phase 1, 2, 3 and 4. And actually it's taken us a year to get from here all the way around to here. So we record 10 kilometers a day and we've done 2,850 kilometers. And the other point of this slide is actually, there's a very great difference in terrain. So this line that seems to go on forever on the high plateau in the prairie is quite reminiscent of the sort of general areas here. And this, which is much more rugose, is what we see when we go over the scarps here. So the guys have had to go through quite a lot of different sorts of terrain. So I'm going to move on swiftly from the acquisition of the 2D into the processing, and we'll look at the processing behind the 2D crew, but also have a quick look at some of the repro just to show what we spent our time doing there. So again, I think there's a lot of questions about why it takes so long to acquire data and why it takes so long to process data. Processing data is, we're calling this the fast track because it's the fastest version of the processing. There are still 43 steps in here. Some are intensely people expensive, so there's a lot of work people have to go through trace by trace, picking traces, and some of it is quite compute intense. But typically, once we've tested, we can get through this process in about 2 months for every line or section of line. So when we close the phase, we go through this. And this slide is the first of the sort of before and afters. But in this case, before is the input. So more or less as it comes out of the field raw, there's not much treatment on it. And this is this is the data that's been given to Roger and Daniele for interpretation. And again, I don't do much geology in these talks, but this is line 34, which is, it runs from the Tendrara high up here, so where all our wells are, and it runs through up towards the northeast and through the T10 location. And again, I've been asked to point out that that's the taggy. Just below the taggy is the Hercynian, and the non-conformal strata below, which pinches out and has been eroded off. The gap in there is the Hercynian unconformity. Okay, geologist?
Yeah.
Geologist. So now I'm going to, that previous version, I'm going to allow it to step through this so you can see how it builds and potentially why we've got 2 months of work stuck into this. So this is going to advance without me touching it, so I'll try not to break it. And so Shearwater have been tasked with decreasing the noise, increasing the signal. They're also trying to increase the continuity on all the horizons, but without taking out the very important faulting. And then they've been asked to balance the amplitudes both in this direction and this direction. So the amplitudes vary because in areas where it's very hard at the surface, it's very difficult to get energy into the ground. It tends to come out sideways. And where areas where it's gravel, it's quite easy to get energy in. So you get almost a 10-to-1 difference in the amplitude. And that's important when we're considering things like AVO. So you know we've been chasing down AVO and AVA anomalies. It's actually very difficult to do so. But on data like this, the underlying gathers do stand a chance of work. So that's before and after the 2D processing. This one is before and after repro. So geophysicists love putting circles around it, so we're only looking at the bits inside the circles. But I think the takeaways here are the significant improvement over here of the definition of the tagging. So this is old data, legacy data. It's also over down here in SPK. No particular reason other than it's a really good example of the uplift we get from that. So there's 2 things here. We see an uplift in the image, But almost more importantly, we have a certainty about the velocities that we've used to process this data. So that's the speed of the sound through the rock, which means when we move the event structurally, we're more certain that they are where we think we are than we were with the old data. So there's two things here. It's easy to interpret, and we're probably going to interpret it in the right place. So we've spoken, or I've spoken about the acquisition going into the processing, and that feeds into the interpretation, which we'll deal with in the seismic interpretation. I'm now going to talk about full tensor gradiometry, which feeds into the geological studies bit. So geophysics is driving geology, and it's also driving geochemistry, and Jason's got a lot to talk about this integrated workflow here. So there's been some frustration about the number of pictures that we've been able to give you about FTG, so full tensor gradiometry. That's for two reasons. The Moroccan government banned any cameras on the plane because you can't get a license for aerial photography, and the US State Department banned any pictures of inside the plane. So if you imagine this as the door, if you were going to get on and turn left into business class, you can't do that because business class is full of a gradiometer that the State Department export restricted. We can't take photos of it. The operator in capital class right at the back of the plane, which is not so much fun for 6 hours a day, and that's a relatively benign instrument rack, which is how it's governed. So we're allowed to take that photo. We're allowed to take that photo, which is the old terminal. So if you fly into Uster, the new terminal's over there, the old terminal, and in the background there's the King's terminal, which none of us get to use. And that's the map. So we recorded full tensor gradiometry, a scalar gravity array, a magnetometer, and a LiDAR on this plane, and we did that over Q4 last year. So a few words on full tensor gradiometry. So I get asked 3 questions about full tensor. Honestly, I do get asked 3 questions about full tensor gradiometry. So really, what is gravity? And I guess we all know what gravity is. Classically, Newtonian gravity is the force of attraction between bodies with mass, that's any bodies with mass, and more recently the sort of Einsteinian concept of gravity, which is massive bodies which distort space-time, and the concepts of gravity waves and light bending as it passes close to very massive bodies and black holes. So gravity is a scalar quantity, which means it's directionless, but the gravity field is a vector. And the reason I have Sean Connery up there is, if we remember the hunt for Red October, actually that submarine was when it was running down the submarine canyon, it was trying to escape from the Russians at that point, it was being navigated on a map generated on gravity. So it knew where the canyon walls are, and the reason it knew where the canyon walls are is it had a Russian version of that. So gravity changes, you can think of it as having a vertical gravity and two horizontal components, so gx, gy, gz. So the second question is, what is a gravity gradient? So that is the rate of change of gravity in each of those directions, and that is a tensor, which means it has 9 components. So that's the definition of the tensor, of 9 components. And then what is full tensor gradiometry? It means you measure all 9 of those components independently. In fact, you measure just those because these are conjugate pairs. But that's what we do in the field. And then the fourth question is, how do you do that? Well, actually, it's a state secret, so I shouldn't really tell you, and I'll probably have to kill you once I have told you. But this is a black box. It's a cryogenic black box, and inside the black box are 3 discs, and they spin on each axis, and they have lots of accelerometers on them. So as the disc spins, If you sum the accelerometer that's going up and sum the accelerometer that's going down, you can take out the motion of the plane, which means you can fly one of these around even though the plane, that twin otter, is giving it this and obviously has quite a lot of acceleration going on. And the next slide is really to describe that. So, as I say, we didn't have access to very much by the way of photography, so we actually told somebody where the plane was going to be and asked him to go and stand in the desert till it arrived. So, thank you, Kelly. Oops, sorry. In here somewhere is that my ability to start the video. There we go, technical glitch on it. Is it working? Cool. So, go out and sit in the desert. It's actually, that's bright sun, so it's the middle of August this was. A little plane's coming along. It's doing around less than 90 knots and it's doing 120 meters up. So the guy in the back who's been sat there in that jump seat for 5 hours since they left Usha, they go down and you've seen the map and they fly backwards and forwards. We achieve typically five commercial flights per day. They all happened in the morning because it's more thermally stable, so there's less noise of the plane moving around. So the FTG is capable of cancelling quite a lot, but not all of the noise coming out of the system. 256 total lines, that includes prime lines, tie lines to turn it into a 3D grid. And we also did a serpentine line down the edge of the block just because the Algerian border is serpentine. And we acquired 26,000 kilometers of data, and again, 26,000 is equivalent to flying to Perth and back. I'm sure if everybody's done that, they do that in business class rather than in the back of the plane like our guy did. So what does FTG data look like? Again, this is a before and after comparison. So this is the existing gravity database, and this was done by the Russians in 1963. It was done on the ground. There's nothing wrong with doing it on the ground. It's just that there's about 5,000 points in here. Whereas in here, it's continuous recording, and you can see we've managed to get absolute block coverage, apart from the rim on the Algerian border, and this is governed by the Moroccan security forces who didn't want us flying a plane too close to Algeria because relations are sometimes fraught. And again, this is a before and after. We have upgraded the geophysical database over time, and this is the sort of image that we'll drive forward into Jason's talk about basin morphology and definition, the basin model. So, in closing, it's been a fairly swift run through this, so I hope you've got a feeling for the complexity and the duration of the geophysical operations. Secondly, there's the before and after. So we started off with a suboptimal image, and this is pretty much state of the art in terms of gravity. The seismic is pretty much state of the art in terms of 2D gravity. And the third thing is that it's part of an integrated geophysical project, and the integrated geophysical project supports an integrated exploration project. So there is method in this madness, and here he is. Here's Dr. Jason Canning, who is the method in this, not the madness. So thank you very much. If there are the odd question, I can take them now. I'm not sure how we are for timing, but we're going to move on.
Gary, if we could get my slides up, please. What a fabulous introduction, Tim. Thank you very much. If I could have the clicker.
Oh, yeah.
Your ultrasound. Great. So good morning, everybody. As Tim said, my name's Jason Canning. I've got about 30 minutes to take you through really two elements of the geological work that we've been doing for the last 18 months. The first piece is really around the basin model and the petroleum system, and the second piece I'm going to take you through the sedimentology, what we've learned about the actual Tag E reservoir. So in terms of the basin model, the basin analysis, Tim has already presented you with this slide. So this is the output of the FTG. This is a fantastic data set. So really that is the canvas on which we can build a basin model. Without this, we've really got nothing. So that's the key information that's allowed us to build a basin model. And really, what is a basin model? So a basin model is something that allows us to describe how a basin has evolved through both space and time. So it's a model which covers the whole of the block. It's based on this data set. And it's a model which covers the whole of geological time through this block as well. And John introduced geological time in his introduction, and really for us geological time starts at about 500 million years ago, in the middle Paleozoic. So we build a model which covers this whole area and gives you 550 million years of Earth history. Now from this map, and from everything else that we've been talking about, we know that this block is really complex. And two of the things that make it really complex but make it prospective are that it's been impacted by two major periods, what we as geoscientists call orogenesis, which just means kind of squeezing, really. And the first period we call the Hercynian orogeny, and these orogenies, these periods of squeezing, have affected all of Europe. The first period is the Hercynian. It impacts Britain. There's a great picture from Devon, my summer holiday there. And the second period happens later. We call it the Alpine event, which forms the Alps, a nice picture from France. So we need to build a model, and we need to understand the risk around these events and how they impact our petroleum system. And actually the one that's really important for us is the Hercynian orogeny. So what is the Hercynian orogeny and what impact does it have on us? So I'm going to illustrate this with a fantastic picture from Somerset. So again, the geology in the Tendrara area is mirrored across Europe. So this is a picture of the Hercynian orogeny. And what you can see there are two very different rock types, and they're divided by a surface. And that surface is the Hercynian unconformity. Below it, there's some rocks which I've coloured blue here, which actually are Paleozoic, and above it's a very different set of rocks, which in this instance are Triassic. They're the equivalent of our Tag E. So there's two very different rock types. And we know, because we can date rocks, that this lowest rock type is about 380 million years old, and the rock above it is much, much younger. It's only about 220 million years old. So at that surface, the unconformity, there's about 160 million years of missing time. And it's not that nothing has happened then. There's a huge amount of things that have happened. But in this section, we've got no information which tells us what's gone on there. So in order to be able to build a basin model, we need to be able to quantify what's happened at this time. And so this has been quite a major piece of work for us in our blog. So what we've done is a piece of work, is absolutely amazing piece of work, which John introduced at the start of the talk, which is called appetite fission track analysis. Big name for actually quite a simple process. So apatite is a fantastic mineral. There's a nice picture of one of the crystals on the left of the screen. So apatite is a calcium phosphate. It's actually the same material that your teeth enamel is made of. And it's a great mineral because it's really, really hard, like your teeth enamel, and it forms, and we find it in a lot of sediments. So we find it in all our Paleozoic sediments, and we find it in the Tag E, and we find it in the Jurassic sediments above it. And what's even more amazing about it is that it's a calcium phosphate. I'm trying to turn the slides off. Uranium can substitute for calcium in its crystal lattice. And bear with me, we all know that uranium is radioactive. And so uranium has a couple of isotopes, and one of those isotopes decays. Uranium-235 decays by emitting an alpha particle. And these alpha particles, they actually burn a track in the apatite crystal. And what you can see in this image on the right is a very zoomed in photo of an apatite grain from our tag E, and in there you can see small lines which are the fission tracks. They're the track that's burned by the alpha particle when it gets emitted. Now the amount of energy the alpha particle has is controlled by temperature, so the length of those lines are a proxy for temperature in our crystal. So why is this important for us? I'm going to show you two really boring graphs here, but these are the results of our apatite fission track analysis for TE8. The graph on the left is a graph of temperature. So we've got temperature on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And temperature really is controlled by burial. So we can turn that temperature data into the graph on the right, and that's a graph of burial for TE8. And going back to our Hercynian unconformity, we said we need to quantify what happens at the unconformity. Well, this tells us that there's been a huge amount of burial in TE8 before the Hercynian unconformity, then uplift, and then subsequent burial. And what the apatite work tells us is that TE8 was buried probably 2.3, maybe 2.5 kilometres in the past before the Hercynian unconformity, and then it was uplifted again. So that's really important to know, because when it was first buried, it would have started to generate and produce hydrocarbons, and we need to be able to quantify that. So that's one really important piece of work that we've done.
But you say the lower down it is, the hotter it is.
Yes, so depth is generally a proxy for temperature. So the deeper things are buried, the hotter they get typically. There are sometimes other controls. So that tells us about the history, what's happened at TE8 in the Paleozoic and the Tag E. Okay, we've done other pieces of work to be able to populate our basin model. And another really nice piece of work is actually we've gone back and we've looked at real detail at the hydrocarbons that we've recovered from Tendrara. So two photos here. This is the condensate from TE5, just in a jar, and TE7, which is in a nice geochemical can. Condensate is the liquid. It's kind of like the oil, the very light oil, which drops out of the gas when you get it to surface. So we've got these samples, we can analyse them, they give us a lot of information. What's also been wonderful is that we've gone back and looked in detail at some of the rock we recovered. And this is an image from T5, from the Tag E. The scale on there is 0.5 millimetre, so you're looking at what we call a thin section. It's a slice through the Tag E rock. And the white grains here are sand grains, they're quartz. But what's really interesting for us is this black material, and that's actually oil. It's very old oil, it's kind of like bitumen or tar, but it's actually an oil. So there's been early oil into the reservoir in Tendrara, and actually we can extract that oil and we can analyse it as well. And the results of those analyses are shown on this, again quite a boring slide, but why we do this is because by looking in detail at the chemistry of the oils and the gases, we can effectively find a geochemical fingerprint which tells us when and where that oil and gas was generated. So you'll remember from your chemistry that hydrocarbons, normally call them alkanes, are defined by the number of carbon atoms in them. So methane has one carbon atom, ethane 2, propane 3, butane 4, pentane 5, and on and on. And so we classify hydrocarbons based on the number of carbons. We call it C1, C2, C3. And this image at the top is the analyses we've got of one of the condensates. Actually, this one's from T7. And it's kind of abundance of hydrocarbon on the y-axis, and along the x-axis is the type of hydrocarbon. And here we've labelled some. So you've got really the C1s, the C2s, the gases have been lost. You see C7, C8. These are the gasolines. This is the kind of stuff you put in the car, octane here. And we go right up to C10, and then we go right down to really heavy hydrocarbons in really small quantities called C25, 26, up to C30, 35. And actually, when we get to these heavy hydrocarbons, that's where we find the fingerprint that tells us where this is from. And in this example, there's a chemical that we find, it's called C29 alpha methylhopane, which tells us exactly where that oil has come from. So where is that oil from? Well, the methylhopane tells us that it's from a very distinctive geological environment. It's kind of telling us almost from a time, and we can link that back to source rocks which we see in the field. So for the first time now, having done these analyses, we can say that the oils and the gases are generated from a Paleozoic source. It's probably Devonian. It's a carbonate source, a restricted marine carbonate source, and it's probably one of these sources which we can see in the field in Morocco. So why is that important? So that means now we can put a source rock in our basin model. So these are just examples of the kind of work that we've been doing, really to get us to the point of building a basin model. A basin model is about being integrated. It's taking all the great work that Tim has produced for us, that the geophysicists have produced, lots of different pieces of information, and trying to pull it into a big basin model. And what it does is that it allows us for the first time to not only say how much hydrocarbon is generated, but it's allowed us to say where maybe has that hydrocarbon migrated, and that has enormous impact for our prospect risking. A bit of advertising for the guys, IGI, who are based down in Devon, actually in Bideford, were the guys that built the basin model with us. So, what does the basin model look like? So it's always really dangerous to show videos at these events, but that's amazing, so it works. So this is a video of what our basin model looks like. So this is a depth surface, so the sheet with this kind of bent is a depth surface of the tag E, and this really is just to illustrate the 3D nature of our basin model. So in it we can see low areas where we know we can generate hydrocarbons, and then we can see high areas where we think hydrocarbon will migrate. Hydrocarbons are great, they always flow uphill. So that's an example of what our basin model looks like, and in there the vertical sticks are wells. We incorporate all of our well data, our geochemical data, all of our temperature data. So we try to build a big model, and here I've just taken a slice through that model, and we populate it with all the rock types that we think are in that model. So this slice here goes across our map from the west to the east. It goes through some of the key wells in our area. And in it, we've populated lots of different rock types. I won't go through all the detail, other than to say that the tag E is the blue surface here, and the salts above it are the pink, the dark pink, and the light pink. So that's really what we're focusing on. Models are always models, unless you can calibrate them to something. And what's great about our area is that we've got a couple of gas discoveries. So we've got T5, the Horst, and we've got SBK. So when we run our model, if our model is not showing gas generated in migrating into our discoveries, we know we've got a problem with it. So we go back and rerun it. And actually, I must say, a model isn't a single model. We run hundreds of different sensitivities. So we'll change the temperature constraints, we'll change the thickness of these units, we'll change the richness of our source rock to try and capture the range of outcomes. This is a map which just tries to show some of the complexity in the model. So this is a map, again, over the whole area, which shows the variation in thickness of one of our source rocks, the Devonian. And the thick areas are the greens and blues, and the thin areas are the reds here. So actually, with the data which Tim has given us, we can start to say we're recognising areas where we might have thicker source rocks, and these are the areas that could well be our kitchens where we generate hydrocarbon. So let's have a look at some of the results then. I'm going to show you a couple of maps. So the first map, I'm going to show you a video of the gas which is expelled in our block through time. What you're looking for are the red colours on here, and that shows where we're generating a lot of gas. And at the bottom, there's a time marker. So we start at 350 million years ago, and we go through to the present day. And the important thing to look out for is the Hercynian unconformity, about 250, 260 million years. So let's start it. So this is generating gas. So Hercynian unconformity, it's not a lot of gas generated actually. We get younger, and now we start generating lots of hydrocarbons, and then we get to the current day. So what you saw, I'm going to try and play this again, see if this works. Okay, let's go again. Brilliant. So Hercynian unconformity, not very much gas generated, and then 150 million years on, that's when we start generating lots of gas. So that's really, really important for us. It's telling us when hydrocarbons are being generated. So let's contrast it with the next slide, which is oil. Same map, you're looking for the hot colours again, same time scale at the bottom. So let's play it and look when the oil is generated. Okay, wow, what's different here is that there's a huge amount of oil generated before the Hercynian and not very much after. So let me play that again. Remember the Hercynian unconformity. Right, go forward. The Hercynian unconformity about 250, 260 million years. So, bang, wow, that's where all the oil's generated before the Hercynian. Not much after, apart from in that area just there. So again, very important for us. It looks like a lot of the oil was generated way back in time before the Hercynian. There must be a concern that that oil's been lost. So one of the outputs of this model, which we RNS to you, was an idea of how much hydrocarbon has been generated in the whole license, which we RNS'd earlier in the year. And this is a graph which helps us to understand that. So if you just focus on the large graph, so we've got time on the bottom axis, on the x-axis, and then we've got the amount of hydrocarbons on the y-axis here. And red is gas, and that's supposed to be green, but it looks black from here. Is that green? Anyway, green is oil, and blue we don't need to worry about, it's the ratio of gas to oil. So this is telling us when our hydrocarbons are generated. I've got some animation here. The important time for us is in black here, the Hercynian, and in pink here, that's when the salt is deposited. That's when we've got our seal. And what you'll see is that on the green plot, most of the oil is generated before the Hercynian, and then there's not very much generated after, whereas the story for gas is very different. Most of the gas, a little bit of gas generated before the Hercynian, but most of it's generated after. So that in pink is the age of our source rock, So this is telling us why we've got a dominantly gas basin here, because most of the oil has been lost previously.
Digital seal.
Because it's the seal, sorry, yeah, sorry. So, one more video, this is going to play in the background whilst I talk. So those magic numbers that you were looking for have come out of this basin model. So we've taken the hydrocarbon generated over the whole area. We've only looked at what's been generated after the Hercynian. We've assumed everything else has been lost. And then we've applied some parameters to those numbers to say how much hydrocarbon is then lost when it migrates through the rock. And that's how we get to the numbers, the 7, 20, 34. And those are oil and gas equivalent numbers there. So that's the potential of the block. The headline is the numbers are really, really big. There's a huge amount of hydrocarbon generated. I think other than the headline, that's really, for us, that's not a hugely important number other than it says we're in a very prospective block. What's really important for us now, what we demonstrate on the video, is actually where is that hydrocarbon migrated to? And then we should see the basin model in action in a moment, and we'll see migration. Brilliant, there we go, bang. So there, on the model, you can see hydrocarbon migrating out of this deep kitchen and into potential accumulations. So gas is red, oil is green there. And that's a really, really important part for us. So that's enabled us now to look at prospects over the whole of our area. So this is a map of the whole block. It shows depth to the Hercynian unconformity. So the deep areas are blue, that's where the rocks are low and hot, that's our kitchen. High areas are red. The dark polygons here are our prospects. Really important ones are A1 in northeast Latvia. And the hashed areas are the areas which we call a fetch area. And they're the areas in which hydrocarbon can migrate up dip and into a prospect. So the headline for A1, which is great, the fetch area for A1 is huge. And it taps right into this kitchen. So that immediately tells us that charge risk is low for A1. That's not quite good enough for us. So what we do is look at the same sort of plot, time on the bottom, amount of hydrocarbon, gas generated in red, oil in green. Our key time spots here, the Hercynian and the seal, and this is just for the A1 area, the fetch area. And our model is telling us, just in A1, there is a very large amount of gas generated, multi-TCF, that can migrate up into A1. Don't use that as a headline number, because remember the prospect isn't big enough to hold 8 TCF, but that's telling you that a lot of hydrocarbons generated and can migrate up dip. One other item that we RNS'd is we mentioned an oil play in Anawal, and this is where the oil play comes from. So this is a prospect in Anawal. It's near an historic well called RR1, which didn't go down into the Paleozoic. What this tells us is that actually in that part of the block, the petroleum system history is a bit different. And in this area, there's the potential for much more oil to be generated. And that's effectively because the source rock hasn't been buried as deeply here. So this is where we generate our Paleozoic oil play in Anawal. So again, the importance of this model, I think I've got it on the next slide, is that we can tell now, we can predict, where the hydrocarbon may have migrated to and when. So that's really the conclusion of the basin modelling. There's a lot of science at the start of that, which is to demonstrate to you the amount of work that we've done and the amount of data that has been used to constrain this model. So we're confident we've got a complex and a believable basin model. We're confident we've captured the uncertainty in it. The headlines in terms of the prospect risking The A1 in northeast Latvia, there's a low risk on charge. And interestingly, we think we can generate an oil play from this in certain parts of the block as well. So I think that's what I'm going to finish on there. I think I'm just on time, guys. Am I? Questions now or after?
We can take one question.
Maybe do one question if someone's got one.
Well, just a quick one. What's the PW markers?
PW, sorry, I should have mentioned that. They are pseudo wells. So in order so they're not real wells. So in order to aerially constrain temperature in burial over the block, we generate a number of pseudo wells, which are just control points. Really good question. I should have mentioned that. Thank you. Maybe one other question. If not, I'm happy to talk through this. We can talk about appetite fission track, geochemistry, whatever you like, or we can talk about what's coming out of the basin model at lunchtime.
With all this work, do you now understand why TE8 didn't work? So
What a perfect segue into the next
Talk
section.
about that in the next section then.
So if we could get the next set of slides, please, Gary, we're going to talk about sedimentology. So yeah, that was almost like a planted question.
I'll take my fee later.
Thank you. So the basin model, it's the sedimentology slides. Yeah, brilliant. So the basin model tells us about hydrocarbon, where it's generated, when, where it's gone. I'm going to talk to you for 15 minutes about sedimentology, and the question we're going to address is the question we just had from the room. So after TE8, we had to go back to the basics and really look at the geology and all the data we had on the TAGI to explain why this didn't work. So really the question, why was there very little effective reservoir in TE8? That was a big surprise to us. This is just a picture of the TE8 core, actually, and so here's a sand in it, light coloured. You can see a few big pebbles in there, and here's a mud. And in the mud, you can see these white areas, and these are fossil rootlets. And that's part of the story here. The fossil vegetation in TE8 is part of the story. But what I was using this slide to say is that we had to go back to the basics. We had to go back and look at the petrology. Petrology is the description of the rock, the grains. We had to look at the biostratigraphy, the age of this rock. We had to even attempt chemostratigraphy, so to look at the chemical age of the rock. And we had to go and liaise with a whole raft of experts who we've had out in the field looking at outcrops in Morocco and other places to understand how the TAGI works as a reservoir. So what is the TAGI? So my French is awful. It's the Triassic Argilo-Griso inferior. So it's the Triassic mud sand lower. So it's a clastic deposit. Clastic means it's sand, it's not a limestone. And it's a really mixed deposit. And John spoke about how it's quite a poor quality reservoir compared to Algeria. It does work if you stimulate it, but it's not easy. So the TAGI's a real mix of sands and muds and conglomerates. Positively though, we know that it does work. So we've got TE6, and this is an image of the TE6 core. And in TE6, there's some really nice reservoir, which is the red sand on here. And then there are areas which are not so good, which are light coloured here, and they're filled with cement. And the process of filling pores with cement we call diagenesis. I think I mentioned that on the slide. And really, diagenesis is a problem for us because it means you get a nice sandstone full of pores which can hold hydrocarbon, and in geological time they get full of cement and they get blocked up. And really understanding the distribution of pore space in this rock is critical because that constrains how much gas we can get in the rock or oil and how that can flow, so how much we can produce, how much is recoverable. So, one of the studies we did, biostratigraphy. So biostratigraphy, we get some clever guys with microscopes and they go and recover pollen. And these are fossil Triassic pollen, 220 million years old or so from the Tag-E, and they can use that they can look at published records of pollen over the world, and they can use that to define the age of the Tag-E. And actually now we know that the Tag-E is quite late Triassic in age. It's a period that we call a Carnian. It's one of those periods of geological time. And what we know about the Carnian, maybe analogue for the present day, it was a kind of greenhouse system. So atmospheric CO2 was really, really high. It was very hot. It was very wet. Lots of semi-arid places, like North Africa at this time, were subject to kind of monsoonal type conditions. They're very hot at certain times of the year, very wet at other times of the year. And those sort of environments, we know, encourage the growth of vegetation. So that's someone's nice fantasy of what the Carnian period looked like in North Africa. So we know the age, we know a bit about the environment. So we mentioned chemostratigraphy. So again, we took all the rock samples from all the wells, and here is an image which shows wells, again, from OSD, it's that same line across the block, through the T5, 6, 8, up to a well in the north, JK. And we analysed each of the samples, kind of metre intervals in the Tag-E, and we tried to chemically correlate them. And this is that chemical correlation. And what's interesting is that T5, T6, there's a very nice correlation. We can see these chemical zones. But as you go into T8, it's actually quite different. So it looks like, we know T8 is different in terms of reservoir, but it looks like chemically they're really quite different as well. So we've gone back and we've really looked at the geology of the Tag-E. And again, I said that the Tag-E is a real mix of different components. This is the core from T1. So this is the lower part of Tag-E. And in there, you can see some big quartz pebbles. And they're really angular. So they haven't been rolled about very much. They haven't been moved very far. We call this an immature texture. So this rock, these sediments haven't been moved about much in a river. And we can go and look at Tag-E in the field as well. We work with a group in Manchester University. And actually, those of you who did the investor trip with John last year, you'd have been to this outcrop. And you've seen this same geology. You can see the pebbles here. It looks just like the Tag-E in our wells. We also see great sandstones in the Tag-E. So two outcrops here which show actually much cleaner, much more mature rocks. These have been worked around quite a lot. You don't get the pebbles in these rocks. These make brilliant reservoirs. So this is great. And we can also go and look, this is the Manchester guys have been working just to the west of Tendrara, and we can actually see the Tag-E sitting on the Hercynian unconformity. So we can understand what the topography was like before the Tag-E was deposited, and that's really important for us because that allows us to link what we see in the field with what we see on the seismic. Tim's already shown you this slide, but here you can see steeply dipping Paleozoic stratigraphy, and then you can see the Hercynian unconformity with the bright Tag-E sitting above it. So that's really important. It allows us to understand almost the surface on which the Tag-E was deposited. So bringing all these things together, we can develop what we call a depositional analogue for the Tag-E. So we think the Tag-E actually in the T5 horse was deposited in a feature that looks just like this. So this is a modern day image from Death Valley, but what you can see is this wonderful feature which we call an alluvial fan or a distributive fan. So you've got a river coming out of the mountains here, and then it goes onto a plain, and you get all these small channels coming out here, And this is where you deposit sand and gravel and conglomerates, and this is what the taggy looks like. So that's fabulous. So now we can start to say how big we think the taggy depositional architecture is, and we can say something about the variation of taggy reservoir quality. So again, let's go back to reservoir quality. So what was different between the taggy that works, T6, and the taggy that doesn't work, T8? So these are two thin sections again. So they're a slice of rock, and we shine light through it with a microscope. The scale bar, that's 0.5 millimetre. The scale bar is same on each, 0.5 millimetre. And again, we can see the quartz grains, which are white. We can see some big fragments, look like messy rock. It's like a little pebble, this one. But what's really different, strikingly different about these two rocks is in here you see a lot of blue material. And the blue is space, it's open pore space. And that blue area is where you get gas, where you get oil, and how you can get a rock to flow. And in T8, you don't get any of that blue, you get this nice pinky material. And this is a mineral called calcite in this instance, and it fills all the pores. So there's no space in this rock to put gas, and even if there was, it wouldn't flow because none of those pores are connected. So why is that? Go back and think about our depositional architecture. Where in this architecture do you get good sand, this material, sorry, and where on that alluvial fan do you get this pore material? So this is a published paper, but this is a cartoon of one of those alluvial fans. So the river which comes out the mountains is here, and you can see this distributive framework coming out from a point source. And what we think we have in Tendrara is that we didn't, someone else drilled T5, but they drilled it in a nice active river bed. And then we drilled T6 quite close to it, probably in the same area. And then we drilled T7 between them, probably in the same area. And then we drilled T8, and we drilled it probably out of this active channel area. And we drilled it in an area which has probably been vegetated and has developed soils, and those soils have destroyed our reservoir. And we can demonstrate that on this slide. So again, go back to our biostrat. So we know the age of the taggy, Carnian, it's quite a wet period. And we saw that lovely cartoon of a desert with lots of plants in it. We know deserts actually are pretty wet anyway, and if you've seen some of the weather forecasts in Tendrara currently, it's been raining a lot, and deserts tend to be quite well vegetated. The sandy deserts that you see on TV are pretty rare. And when you get vegetated desert, you produce this material. And these have the wonderful name of rhizoconcretions, but what they are fossil roots. And they're actually really common. And this material, these fossil roots, they're made of calcite. They're the same material that we saw blocking the pores in T8. So this is our problem. This is what's really destroyed the reservoir quality in T8. Now this stuff can only form where it's not being washed away. So in an active river channel, you don't get vegetation because it can't grow there, it washes away. So this forms in areas where you're not getting reworking of the sediment. So how does that help us build a reservoir model? So this is now a Google Earth image of our same area in Death Valley. I think it's nice because it demonstrates the reservoir models which we're building. So we're looking down now from satellite, but here you can see the mountains on this side, you can see the mountains on this side, and you can see those nice alluvial fans which we were talking about. And we can see a whole series of fans on this side of the valley, and a whole series on this side of the valley. And what's typical about these environments is that in the middle, you get a system called an axial system. So when you get really heavy rain, you get a lot of flow down onto these fans, and everything pumps down the main valley, the axial system. So let's look at that again. So this is just a 3D image of that same area. And let's talk about the wells again. So again, you can see the alluvial fan, you can see the mountains, you can see the axial system. So in that axial system, there is so much energy, there is so much reworking of material that you don't develop vegetation in here. It's too violent an environment for things to grow. And that's an area that we've identified is an area where we can develop good reservoirs. So again, the analogy, 5, 6, 7, drilled in an active channel. 8, drilled in one of these abandoned channels, which is vegetated, destroyed porosity. So what we're looking for then, in terms of A, and in terms of northeast Lackbeer, is to identify somewhere out in the main channel, the axial channel, where we get reworking, we don't have destroyed reservoir. So that's really what we've been working on. And this is a map. This is not a great map in terms of a visual aid, but this is a map of our block, which really describes our reservoir model. So you'll recognise the block outline. The 5, 6, 7 wells sit here. T8 is this well here, T2 here, SBK here, RR there. The brown, dark brown areas are where we've identified alluvial fans, these nice fan bodies. And the light brown area, that sort of orangey area, is the area where we think we may get axial systems. This hashed area is where we get no deposition, so these are the mountains, and the light brown area is the fringe of the mountains. So the area, and we've developed this model from the FTG, the data Tim's provided, from the mapping that the guys have provided, and from well data as well. And so we are identifying areas which are shown in the dotted lines here, that we think are the axial channels where we get reworking of sediment, we don't get destruction of reservoir. And that's where we've placed the A1 in the northeast Lackbeer wells. So that's really, stop.
Yeah, I'd like to take a couple of questions.
Sorry, so final slide. So we're a year and a half down the line now. We know a lot more about the Tag E than we did when we drilled T8. I think we can describe what happened at T8. We have built a model, but it is still a model. So we've done the best job we can do with this reservoir, with this data. And we think we can identify areas of better reservoir, but reservoir effectiveness, it will remain the key risk in this play. For the reasons I've demonstrated, John spoke about this earlier. So 9 in 10 are located in areas where we predict better reservoir, but it's still the key risk. So I think that's the message.
Take a couple of questions for Jason, if anyone's got any. Otherwise, all of the team will be present on countdown to really ask questions. So, one question or 2 questions now?
Yes, I have to ask, on what basis then was T8 location decided?
So I think T8 was decided pre any of this work. So I think the assumption was that the reservoir quality that we saw at 5, 6 and 7 would be the same. So T8 was located on structural closure, and that was the main reason that it was drilled there. So hindsight's a great thing. Without T8 we would not be able to generate this model, but we didn't have this model when T8 was drilled.
These next wells go to drill. Are you going to be taking core samples of those locations as well?
So we're not going to take conventional core, because nowadays that's quite expensive and it's quite a difficult operation. But nowadays we can take sidewall cores, so we run in with effectively, it's a tool with a drill on it, and we're probably going to take 90 core samples through A1 in North East Lackbeer. It's a very extensive data acquisition plan. That's a really good question. Maybe one more.
You haven't mentioned Veyron at all.
So I've been talking only about the Tag E here. So the Tag E is the Triassic Reservoir. I'm not going to steal Roger's thunder, so Roger and Daniele,
Right.
we'll talk about that.
We'll take lots more questions.
Yes, that's a good
during
segue,
the-
so thank you.
during the lunch, but so don't be afraid to walk up to the guys and ask questions during the lunch.
So I'm going to hand over to our geophysicist Daniele Triponi, who's going to take you through some of the mapping.
Good morning. Okay, I'm Daniele Tripone, the geophysicist. I worked basically on all the data we acquired this year, all the seismic data that Tim showed you, and also on the vintage data we reprocessed always this year. And I have integrated all this data with also the gravity data. And all this data allowed me to produce a map of our reservoir and to define the prospectivity of the area outside the 3D volume, the 3D seismic volume. So, this is the map of our permits, and my focus is on this red polygon. In white, we can see the lines we acquired recently. In black, the vintage data. I have basically interpreted around 105 seismic lines and of different type. And as I told you, all included in this polygon, in this red polygon. This is an example of the lines, of the new lines. I have interpreted 7 main key horizons. Our reservoir is the light blue, the taggy, the top taggy. And this interpretation is representative of the variability, the vertical variability of the subsurface. So this is the map of the top reservoir. You've already seen it, of the top taggy. It's derived, as I told you, from the interpretation of 105 seismic 2D lines and also the 3D volume here on the T5 holes highlighted in this polygon. And you can note here a hole. This is where a Paleozoic eye is present and where the tag is not being deposited. But Roger will talk about it deeply after me. And here on the west, there is our first object of interpretation. It is the A1 structure. I will show you how the structure looks like on a seismic line here, the yellow seismic line on the next slides. But first, let's see the history of this prospect, because A1 is an historical prospect. It's been defined for the first time in 1977. Has been, you can note that the shape of this prospect is very different across the years. From 84 to 2007, no more new data have been acquired. And you can see how the shape is different depending on the subjectivity and personal experience of different interpreters. But now, in 2018, after the new acquisition, we have much more data, because here there are like 10 lines on the structure, so that's why it's a very poor image. But now we can define better our structure here with this new acquisition, and moreover, we increased the chance of success of this prospect that was about 10% before our last acquisition, and now it has been increased up to over 50%. So this is the line crossing A1 structure, A1 prospect here, and crossing the 3D area with the main wells T5, T6, and T8, and the T5 host here. So this is a composition, an arbitrary line consisting of two new acquired lines, and this is the 3D recently reprocessed in 2017 by Shearwater. You can really appreciate the good quality of the seismic data here. This bright reflector is the Tagi, our reservoir. You can easily follow this reflector across all this section up to A1 prospect. This is my interpretation, the 7 key horizon I showed you before, and in light blue is our top reservoir. And you can see all this is A1 prospect, is a structural prospect very similar to the T5 host. And it's the target of our next well, T9. This is the geological interpretation with all the formation across the section. So let's come back to our top reservoir map. So I showed you the A1 structure. From the kitchen, all the gas migrated in this area and also in this area on T5 host. But following this path, the gas arrived till here in the northeast area of the Tagi. So we have been able to define another structural closure here, thanks to the new acquired data. And it's a structural closure on the same trend on T5 host, and it has, as you can see, the same triangular shape. Let's see better how it looks like on this seismic line across here. So this is the line. This is the T5 host, and this is the northeast area with the main wells here. So you can see this is the Tagi, the bright reflector here. You can see a first rollover that is the T5 host here, and the second one here, where our new structure, a three-way deep closure is. This is my interpretation with I remind you, the light blue horizon is our top reservoir. And this is the geological interpretation with the yellow layer that is our reservoir. And this is our structure filled by the gas migrated from the source kitchen area. So we have this structure similar to the T5 host, but thanks to the new acquisition, to the new data acquisition, we have been able also to build an upside case, a bigger trap here, defined by this fault on the east and this stratigraphic trap on the west. So we have this hole that is a Paleozoic height, as I told you, and the Tagi is pinging out against these flanks, against the flanks of this Paleozoic eye, forming what we call, as I told you, a stratigraphic trap. But what is a stratigraphic trap? Let's find out on this seismic line crossing this area. This is the line. So this bright reflector is our reservoir. You can follow it till here, where it terminates against these different reflectors with a different orientation. You can't see anymore the Tagi here, but then it reappears again here in this area. Let's see with the interpretation. So this is the Tagi reservoir, and it terminates here against this Paleozoic eye. This is a big structure, big Paleozoic structure. And so basically with this pinch out of the Tagi here, we have a trap for the gas that migrates in this area. So we defined a barrier on the east, a barrier on the west, But now we have to see something here. What happens here? We can see first an offset on the fourth trend, Lagby fourth trend, and there is also a subtle bend in the contours. Moreover, if we integrate with the data derived from the gravity data analysis, we can easily see a barrier here. In yellow, there are basically what we can identify as fault or ridge. If we superimpose our map on it, you can see that correspond to that bending in the contours and the offset in the faults. This is basically what we call Trari fault. And it's what can allow to define a better trap here. So this is a large upside trap, now defined, thanks to the new data. Let's see how it looks like on the same seismic like I showed you before. So this is the interpreted line, the T5 horst, the other three-way deep closure here, and there is an offset here against the Trari fault. And thanks to all these elements, the gas can be trapped here in a larger closure. And here is where we plan our T10 well. You can note also the intra-Paleozoic fabric, and there is a bright reflector that we can reach with our well. But Roger will talk about it after me. So, what is the potential, the volume potential of the prospect I showed you? For A1 structure, we have up to 1.1 TCF, and for the Northeast Lackbeer prospect, we have up to almost 5 TCF. So we have a big potential here. So which are the takeaways from this presentation? Basically, with the new lines, with the new acquired lines, with the new acquired data, actually also the gravity data, we have been able to enhance our understanding of the area outside the 3D volume. A1 has been better defined, and now is our best and lowest risk prospect, and it will be the target of T9 well. And then with the new acquisition, with the new data, we have been able to improve our understanding of the prospect in the Northeast Lackbeer. That was, basically, it was a concept before this acquisition, but now is a fully defined prospect. And this will be the target of our T10 well. Thanks.
Any questions for Daniele?
Could you just refresh me on when you're going to drill T10? Or is it T9 before Christmas?
So T9, we should have the results of T9 before Christmas, and then these wells will be drilled back to back. So we're already starting to construct the road into the patch of T10 next. So T9 will be drilled first, and then that'll be followed by T10.
Will it be the same rig that moves on?
It will be the same rig that will move on, exactly. I'll give you a little synopsis after we've heard about, dare I say it, the Veyron zone and the Paleozoic from Roger. Yes.
Is it right to conclude from this that T10 is totally independent from T9, and nothing that happens on T9 will affect the drilling of T10?
So we see these as quite independent features, really. They're testing sort of different aspects of the Taggy play overall. So A1 is what you might say is potentially a slightly lower risk. It's our best prospect, a nice, clearly well-defined structural tilted fault block. This is the next well will be testing, that stratigraphic trap. Does that work in this play, in this area? These types of stratigraphic traps do work in Algeria. Casimral, which is the largest gas field there, is at 70, 80 TCF, in that order. a good proportion of the trapping geometry to that giant field is a stratigraphic element to that. So this type of geometry works. We're seeing if it works here, and it has the potential to unlock some pretty vast volume potential, which would be a real game changer in these first two worlds. But the next step probably brings us to the next step would be the bigger game changer, which is potentially down into the Paleozoic, which we're now beginning to unlock, and we're looking at options for the third world T11, which would focus on the Paleozoic underneath. So maybe that's a good time to bring in Roger. So Roger's our second interpreter. So while Danielle has been doing all of this work on the Triassic, there's been so much data coming in that we brought Roger White in as a consultant, interpreter with us, many years of experience in lots of companies, and he's been focused largely solely on this deeper Paleozoic plan to try unlock the deep.
Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate you've been sitting here for some while now, and it's probably only me that's standing between you and your lunch. So I'll try to make this relatively quick, and obviously ask as many questions as you like after I've finished. So as John said, Danielle has been concentrating on the Taggy play, and I've been diving deeper into the Paleozoic. And so these are the questions I'm going to pose, and hopefully you're going to answer for them. So, what is the Paleozoic? We've heard a lot about it before, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about the sort of potential reservoirs and seals and sources within the Paleozoic. Why do we care about the Paleozoic? The Taggyism seems to be enormous. We've got great potential there. Why do we care about the Paleozoic? Once I've established why we should care about it and the potential within it, I'll talk about where it is in Tendrara and how we go about evaluating it. And then the big question is, where should we start and to drill the Paleozoic? So, first things first, what is the Paleozoic? The Paleozoic, going back to John's original, see if I can get some shooting going on here. John's original timescale here, the Paleozoic is the oldest rocks, all the way down to almost 500 million years, and it's the rocks that are pre-Simian unconformity, which we've heard so much about. So within that Paleozoic, you can subdivide it as much as you like, but I will be talking about the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, and the Carboniferous. And what you can see here is a schematic rock column with a background rock in grey, which are our shales, which act as seals. And we have nicely coloured yellow reservoirs here, which are our sandstone reservoirs, and interfingered through here we have a large stack of carbonate rock, into which we some of those are potential reservoirs. And then we have a final flourish, let's say, of some carboniferous plastics. And so going back to, again, I've got a lot of repetition of what other people have already introduced to you. We have our source. So one of the key sources across North Africa is this Silurian black shale. We know from our geochemistry that Jason was talking about that we have a Devonian carbonate source already proven within our block. And I'm going to talk to you about three particular reservoirs that we think have potential within our block. The key point here is that these three reservoirs are stacked within the Paleozoic. So when I talk about the Paleozoic, I don't mean just one reservoir, I mean multiple stacked layers of potential. Okay, so I'm going to sort of zoom in on the lovely regional cross-section that John showed you earlier, and this is a reminder of why the Paleozoic is so important to us. So this is a map of all the oil and gas fields in North Africa, and you can see that our block here is highlighted in yellow. And so a large proportion of these oil fields in green, gas fields in red are in Algeria. And we've always said that almost 70 billion barrels of oil equivalent resources are in Algeria. And the majority of those are trapped beneath our super seal, this salt layer. The salt layer, effectively, before I fall off the podium here, is the base of this black. I've sort of coloured in this section just to highlight the Paleozoic. So they're all trapped underneath the black. But importantly, that's great. And we have multiple Paleozoic rock reservoir types and rocks under here. So we've got the blues, the browns, the yellows, and the oranges. They're all different ages, so we can have different reservoir types. But importantly, 20% of those volumes that are not trapped are trapped beneath the salt are actually trapped in the intra-Paleozoic seals. So it's not just the salt seal we're talking about, which is very important to us, but also have those intervening shales as well. And that's where we get our stacked potential. I put this as a note to myself that, again, we're talking about both plastic reservoirs and carbonate reservoirs, and we've got both primary and secondary porosity, because as Jason has already alluded to, our reservoir properties are subject to diagenesis and change as the reservoirs are buried. Talk to those. Next slide. Brilliant. So this is the Ordovician. So this is the oldest green layer in my Paleozoic, and I'm going to talk to you about this sandstone layer at the top here, and this is related to glacial deposits. So talking about ice age glaciers that are depositing, in this case, a lovely picture of a conglomerate sandstone, and this is taken a picture from. So unfortunately I haven't labelled it, but taken from our North Africa research group based out of Birmingham University. These two pictures up here are thin sections. They're very similar to the thin sections that Jason was showing to you in the tagging. It's exactly the same technique. But here you will see that a lot that, I'll ask you, what is the difference between this section up here from well A and this section from well G? They're both very clean sandstones. So they're very quartz rich, which is this nice sort of yellow clasts. And they're very clean. There's no mixtures of other weird and wonderful lithics in there. And again, the blue areas in both are the porosity. It's that space that was available for our hydrocarbon charge to go into. The difference here is that there is more porosity, more blue space in this well A, and you'll see that is buried down to 1900 meters and a little bit more. This well, the blue space is slightly less, but it's also buried to 1900 meters. The key here is not the present day depth of burial, it's how far the rocks have been buried before they've been squeezed and brought up again, in this case by the Hercynian erosion. So when rocks are squeezed and subject to compression, some go up, some go down. And the rocks, the state of the rock is related to the depth of burial that it used to have before it was uplifted again. And what you see is the porosity. There is porosity, which is amazing, but that porosity has been is now separated. So the gaps between the rocks have been squeezed together, and in this case you've got what are called quartz overgrowth. So the quartz grains have been subject to so much pressure that they've dissolved and regrown into the spaces. So while there's permeability here, while there's porosity, the permeability, which is the ability of the hydrocarbons to flow from one pore space to the next, is reduced. So we've got to keep an eye on how deeply buried these rocks have been in the past. The next reservoir of interest is slightly younger. It's in the Devonian, and if you remember, this is where we have all this blue rock, which is our carbonate rock. And a particular reservoir type of interest are these carbonate reef build-ups, these mounds. And just like the present day, you can imagine these reefs building up in a lovely tower in these lovely warm seas, because during the Devonian time, North Africa was roughly coming into the tropics, and you can get nice warm seas and start to grow these carbonates. And the one thing about reefs is they have fabulous have fabulous primary porosity. So the lovely organisms that grow your coral reservoir architecture leave these big spaces behind. However, obviously when it gets buried, these big spaces, some remain, some do not. But the lovely thing about carbonates is they're very brittle when they get buried. So when we squeeze these brittle rocks, they tend to fracture. And fractures allow us to enhance that primary porosity into what we call secondary porosity. And also links up our porosity and enhances the permeability as well. So fractures, natural fractures within the rock. And finally, a reservoir of interest to us, which is not necessarily particularly important in Algeria, is this latest Carboniferous clastics. And these are these clastics that have been shed off these Essenian age mountains. And there's a lovely picture up here of these big, relatively clean sandstones coming off this mountain range. And we have an example of this Carboniferous sandstones in OSD1, which is just outside our block. It's been penetrated and it's been reported there's a relatively good porosity, around 10%, which for this age rock is quite high. The key here is also that the types of reservoir trapping geometries associated with this slightly later reservoir type, because you can imagine that as the Essenian is building these mountains and creating this unconformity at the erosional surface, you have this interplay of these reservoirs building out onto this unconformity surface. So there's a possibility of quite exotic stratigraphic traps. So again, keeping this idea of stratigraphic trapping potential, which Daniele was talking about earlier, we have exactly the same potential on the other side of the Essenian unconformity and around it for the Paleozoic rocks as well. So, as I mentioned previously, the OSD1 well over here, and I've got an array of all the wells that we have available in our block, Tendrara 3, 4, 1, 5, 8, 2, 1, sorry, JK1. It's a slightly odd order, but it's the order that this yellow line goes in between, so it's effectively west to east. And it shows the penetration, the relative penetration in geological time of these wells. And these are all the Paleozoic well penetrations we have on the block. And you'll notice that some go a little bit deeper, some go a little bit shallower, but none of them have penetrated the full amount of the Paleozoic. And so we still have this large section of undrilled stratigraphy to test and explore. And this is what it looks like. That's what it looks like. There's an enormous space left in geological time. When you look at it in two-way time, which is the sort of what we talk about in geophysics and in our seismic section, is measured in two-way time. We have our well stock here, T1, 5, 6, and 8. So this is our Horst. This is the same section of the 1034 line that Daniele was talking about. And if I then colour it up and focus specifically on the Paleozoic, you will see that there's an enormous amount of space under our well control, underneath the Essenian conformity for which to explore. And we know we've got well control for the blue and the green, but we don't have well control at the moment for the orange, the Solarian, and the Ordovician. So this is my imagination, if you will, of how the layering of the rocks could be. You can see that I'm also drawing on, and I said we're going to flick backwards and forwards, I'm drawing on also the structure. So I'm drawing in folds, and I'm drawing in this unconformity. The unconformity is quite stark when you come up to the northern end of the block. And that's actually very important because, as you can imagine, trying to drill all the way down to the Silurian and Devonian underneath Tendrara Horst, 2 seconds, you're doubling the depth of your well, minimum. It's just too deep. And what happens when our rocks get too deep? They get the porosity and permeability gets destroyed. But importantly, there are places within the block where some of these older reservoirs, potential reservoirs, do come to a shallower surface. And again, we have an unconformity star traps. So by mapping out this structure around the block, which we are starting to do and are continuing to do so, we can start defining potential areas to drill. And one last point here is, it's a small complaint. Daniele's got beautiful, lovely imaging up here in the Mesozoic section. I don't. So I have windows of wonderful imaging app sheets, and this is a fast track image. We are continuing to process this image through, and our imaging is getting better and better even as I speak. But there are large areas of the data where actually I am less constrained by the reflectivity. No sniggering from the front, please. And so this is why we use models. And so we use analogues, and we learn from these analogues and apply the lessons learned from analogues, from papers, from outcrop to help me constrain my imagination. And so this is the same photo that Jason showed you of outcrops. This is from Devon. And it does share a large amount of its geology with the geology in Morocco. This is a little bit closer to us. These two images here are taken from a paper by Beauchamp, a paper that's written on the rocks of the Missouri Basin, which is literally just to the west of us. It's the basin that Shell and Repsol are exploring. And they have recognised significant compressional fabrics within their seismic, which is consistent with our tectonic model of these two, both Hercynian and Alpine orogenic events. And I'm just going to introduce a couple of terms here. You can see they've got syn-rift and post-rift events. If you can imagine a block of rock, and it sometimes when it extends, it creates holes in the ground. These are these rift grounds, this blue rift, syn-rift rock. And that's how we lay down ledge. We create accommodation space, and the rock goes into that accommodation space in basins. However, when that same rock then gets compressed and shortened, in this case, this block diagram here, they've modelled in the Missouri Basin a shortening of about a third. That blue syn-rift rock, the red fault here that accommodated that extension, then gets reversed, and the syn-rift rock gets inverted, and any post-rift rock over the top then gets folded. You get really quite extraordinary geometries, which are ramp flat geometries, which create these lovely anticlines. And I'm going to show examples of this in our data. This is a nod to Tim again. This is the line pattern of our new seismic lines with the wells in white. And this is our gravity map. Now, this gravity map looks slightly different versions to the gravity maps you've seen before. There's a different colour bar, but importantly, we've interpreted the gravity signal in terms of depth to basement. This is really important for me because I need to know where the basement is. And if you see, and you've seen my seismic, I can see the shallow reflectivity, but it's very difficult to see the deep reflectivity. But if I can constrain the deep and I can see the shallow, I can quite or more easily infer what is going on in between. And so this map with the highs in whites and browns and the lows in this dark blue is my gravity-derived basement map. And I use this in conjunction with our newly acquired data and our reprocessed data to help create the images which I'll just start showing. So this map is in the north. It's one of our reprocessed lines called JK12. And you can see instantly that we have quite a lot of reflectivity in the center here. And we've got our overlying Mesozoic section, and there's variable image quality. And this is our interpretation of that stratigraphy. So we have a basement map, a basement surface which is constrained by gravity in pink. We have our blue syn-rift section, our dark green post-rift, And then our later post-rift in light green, which is interpreted as our Carboniferous. We have well control for the Carboniferous, but again, I just must highlight that our age control for the greens and the blues is not there, hence why we've got there the question marks. This is inferred from the geometries that I see on the site. Importantly here, you can see the same geometries that we see next door in the Rizal Basin is replicated here, which is what you'd expect. The other thing I need to point out on this particular line is obviously with this squidging you create these large anticlines, and I want to contrast the size of these anticlinal features to the size of our target anticlines and structures. So this is an example here, and I'll show it again on the next slide again, of a taggy-sized structure. It's a small inverted, and you get a relatively nice taggy reservoir over the top. You compare that to the size of this thrust sheet, or in fact this inverted, and the size is, it's a step change in the size of the structure. I'm going to now show you a slightly odd geometry. So this line here is a combination of two new lines, 1024 and 1017. And there's a change in geometry in the middle. And you can see reflectivity on the southwest flank, and you see reflexivity on the northwest flank. And this is the interpretation of that. And again, it is one of these inverted sin-rift structures. And A1 is this structure in through here. There's relatively low relief when we talk about this green structure. And that's a very robust, very nice structure, the taggy. But when you compare it to the size of these inverted half graben's in the Paleozoic, it pales in significance. So the key point here is we're starting to recognize these large structures. They are complicated, both by the Hercynian conformity and then modified by the later Alpine erosion. And we have this, and they have these potential reservoirs in through here. And what we're going to be doing with TE9 and TE10 is we're going to be starting to drill and extend into the Paleozoic to not only find out more about the reservoir potential within as much as we can, but specifically into what we believe is the Carboniferous and the Devonian Silurian green section. But we're also going to try and test some of these more unconformity-bound structures. So rather than testing the core of this anticline, we're going to be testing the more stratigraphically defined traps on the flanks. So it's actually very exciting. So I'm going to be sort of sleeping and bored with the tagging. As soon as we go through that Hercynian conformity, my ears are going to prick up and I'm going to get really, really interested to find out exactly how much control we're going to have on our reservoir potential as we go into that deeper section. There's your very wrong zone. So whoever asked earlier, A1 deep in the Veyron zone is as part of this large anticlinal structure. And so this is a slide to highlight where we are currently being investigating and continue to map out these inversion style structures. I showed you a line across the Paleozoic lead, and I just showed you a line across the Veyron, which is dark grey sort of polygon, and the A1 deep area. These polygons are on the map as markers, and they will be refined as we refine our maps, which is an ongoing process. And our maps are actually currently not constrained, but focused within this orange polygon, which is where our data from our most recent processing effort has been focused. So as we roll that focus onto phases 3 and 4, our mapping will get wider and will hopefully encompass some of even the oil plays in Panama that Jason was talking about. So, in summary, why do we care? We care because there's significant potential. There's significant potential proven in Algeria, and we see the same plays within our block. What's it look like in Tendrara? the structures look large. We know nothing about the reservoir currently, and we hope to learn more. What we can say is that what we're imaging in terms of structure is big. And what's the plan? Well, we are currently flicking between slides. We're currently, I am mapping up these structures, trying to get the detail up and define some opportunities for us and then define the portfolio. We'll have great interest as we extend T10 into the Paleozoic, and T11, I hope, will take both those open pieces of information and we'll choose a good place, as yet undefined, to drill the Paleozoic.
Any questions for Roger?
John?
T10, what controls the location of T10? Is it the presence of the carboniferous underneath?
No, so T10 is primarily focused on the tank, because that's its primary target. We recognise a stratigraphic trap underneath T10, which is more upside, if you wanted more upside, beyond northeast Lancashire, and that's just a tally structure. But we see stratigraphic upside also great value in understanding as much as we can about Paleozoic.
Okay. The reason why I ask is because earlier slides, your colleague showed that T10 was some distance from where the actual stratigraphic pinch-out occurs.
Yes.
I was wondering why that was.
I can answer that. So the T10 well, you saw that Daniele showed you that there's quite a robust three-way dip closure, a lower risk, if you will, structural trap within the overall stratigraphic trap. So if you drill the well, it's got a chance to prove that lower risk structural closure. But if we see a gas down to, that's de-risking the broader stratigraphic trap, which is a high risk element to that. So it's increasing our chance of success of finding something in the well.
Okay.
So that's the
Thanks.
We were told that the Taki is poorer quality than it is in Algeria. So the Taki is, I think it was mentioned, is 10% porous. Do we know about the porosity of the Paleozoic compared to what it is like in Algeria? So for example, you mentioned the Carboniferous. Carboniferous is 10% porous. Is that similar to Algeria? And what about the others? What about the other layers?
So I think I mentioned that the depth of burial is a significant overlap to the reservoir core, and so the Paleozoic, being older rock, is always going to be buried deeper and potentially poorer quality than the Taki. The interesting part between Algeria and Morocco is that Morocco has suffered more tectonism than Algeria. So Algeria, there are large folds, and we see the similar folds in Morocco and in Tendrara, but the understanding their burial history is much more complicated. And I have to admit, we don't know much about the Paleozoic in our own book. So at the moment we are driven by models. We have, I think you saw my well correlation, we really only tag the surface of the Paleozoic, so we don't know too much about it. So we talk about potential reservoirs, and we have models for these potential reservoirs, but we don't know how they will behave. But it is very encouraging that OSD1 has found, so we understand, relatively decent porosity.
In the carbon.
In the carbons.
Yeah, I was just, one of the first slides, you said Algeria, that 80% of their oil and gas is on the salt sea, but 20% you believe is in the paleo seas. But you haven't got a slide from Morocco.
That's true, because I don't believe there's any Paleozoic fields in Morocco.
Correct. That's correct, yeah. So there are no examples of Paleozoic fields in Morocco, but we're looking at a continuity of your continuation of the same geology in Algeria across into the Tendrara area. We know we have, from all the work that Jason showed you, we've definitely got a paleosection beneath that, we can see it. We have oils and gas sourced from the Paleozoic. OSD1 nearby has proven that there's the potential for potentially some reasonable reservoirs in the Carboniferous. We haven't penetrated, so no one's explored deeper than the Carboniferous in this block. So there's a lot of white space here, so we're not really denying that. But as explorationists, we like that because we can fill that white space with our models and be able to test and explore that. And that's what we're doing here.
But as you Algerian slide said, you've got four to one covered with their salt seals. So presumably 4 times as much gas and oil in that area in Morocco.
Well, I had the understanding that possibly the paleo for us was a much bigger potential than the Tagi.
I think when we talk about the potential is unknown, unquantified yet, but what we can say about Paleozoic is the size of the structures are a step change from the size of the structures in the Tagi. So when we compare the size of the T5 Horst and the A1 structure, they are small compared to the size of the antiforms that we are beginning to recognize in the Paleozoic. So, yes.
So this is illustrated quite nicely here. So the Hercynian open faulty comes in across here. It's in here, and the Tagi sits on top of that. So there's a structure here, there's a small one here, there's another one here. This section beneath the Hercynian, all that's the Paleozoic sitting there. And there you can see there's this enormous structure that comes up underneath through here. And that's the point we have here. So there's some very large structures in this Paleozoic that are beginning to map around rock now. And that's quite important. The question is, can we get that reservoir on top of
possibly larger potential.
Sorry?
One of the things you were saying is why do we care? But you say there is possibly more potential.
Correct. Because the structures down here are much larger.
John, you might want to comment on your conversation with Repsol about the fact that they're looking at Paleozoic. Just to enhance this.
So Repsol in a neighbouring block next door, we understand they're chasing a similar play potentially in the underlying Paleozoic. So they also see OSD1 is drilled on one of these Paleozoic eyes with the Tagi lapping onto the flanks on that, so they're chasing that plate and they're also looking deeper into the Paleozoic.
Not much has been said about the extended well test from 5.6 and 7. Does that really help you guys to understand the base in the overall picture? Where's your views on that now?
Do you want to answer that?
Yes, so we haven't covered it because this is very much an exploration focused presentation, but there's really important information from that, but we're not really covering the development aspects today. But that well test is obviously hugely important.
Okay, so you can't elaborate on that. Is that what you're saying?
Not in the context of this presentation.
We're trying to understand the whole basin.
Well, I think
so the well test gives you information about a relatively small volume in the TE5 Horst. It doesn't really give us information that we can put into a basin model. It is more field-specific information. It's really valuable information for the development. It doesn't really impact the exploration, other than to show
understanding of the recharging of these wells.
Not in terms of the numbers that the exploration numbers that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think the T7 well test, the extended well test there, are very important to understand the flow performance of the reservoir. So can this reservoir produce at commercial rates? Because right at the start, I said that if you look at some comparisons, we talk about that comparison between Algeria and across into Morocco. We said that the Tagi reservoir in Morocco is of poorer quality than what they have in Algeria. And the step change that Sound brought in 2016 and 17 last year was be able to demonstrate with modern completion, horizontal drilling, mechanical stimulation of the reservoir, so that you can flow the gas out of these reservoirs at commercial rates. And that's where that test comes from. It's more about, yeah, you can find the gas in the pore space, but you need to be able to get it out to the surface at commercial rates. So that's the importance of the well test.
You can just hear a bit more about ground truthing, what soil sampling and geochemical analysis has been going on across the piece.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So we didn't touch into that, but I think one of the blocks that I showed on there was, of course, satellite SEPA analysis piece that we did. So we used a company called CGG MPA, and they are looking for potential evidence, which would be indirect evidence of hydrocarbon seepage, which would be mineralogical alterations at the surface. And you can use, I think it's the infrared bands of the satellite image to look for the reflectivity of certain types of clay minerals and carbonate minerals, which could be present where you have a hydrocarbon seep. You need to go forward and ground truth those. So we have a program at the moment that we're just about to kick off, in fact next week, where we're sending someone out to take some soil samples across those areas that are identified. But the nice thing was that we saw on where CGG identified the potential for hydrocarbon seepage to the surface was actually along the main bounding faults. Because remember, we have this fantastic salt seal which keeps the hydrocarbons trapped. We don't want them all to leak out to the surface. But it's good to see them leak out to the surface in some areas of your basin, because it gives you a greater confidence that you're dealing with a prolific system. Okay? So that's some work that we're doing, right now. So we've done the satellite piece of work, but that's an indirect measurement. You can't be certain that satellite information is giving you a true, hydrocarbon seepage or evidence of that. You have to go and put someone on the ground, sample those soils, and see if you can detect hydrocarbons in the substrate. And that's what we do over the next couple of months.
I think we'll take the next set of questions maybe while we have lunch. Sorry to stop you there. There is another function this afternoon, so I don't want you to all go hungry. But the whole team will be there to answer any of your questions. Please just flag me if you don't get your question has been answered, and I'll make sure that you have this. Just let John and Brian say.
So Brian, do you want to say a few words just to sum up? Because I know we said it was a deep dive. Okay, we went pretty deep in some areas. There was a lot of information that we put across there. We've been open. It's a bit like a car. You get to see the bonnet of the car with Brian, and then you open the bonnet now and you've seen some of the engine, and it looks pretty horrific and complicated. But Brian, if you want to say
yeah. So I hope you realise what a really great team we have, actually. And what we've shown you is a year and a half's work, and that would take, with our partners, that would take several days to try to go through it in some depth. And it's really important because this is the risk reduction piece. Now James says, why the hell did you bother with spending all this money for a year?
We didn't pay.
It was seismic and all the geology that's actually you've been shown this morning. And without that, you cannot get from a 5% chance of success to better than 30. This is the only way to get that risk reduction. Yes, we could go out and drill a bunch of wells, but where? Where would you go? No idea. And this is really hard. So maybe what the guys are showing you is we have reduced the risk as much as we can. We're still trying to take it further. It's an ongoing thing. The excitement has got to be the paleozoic now. That really is the game changer in the basin. The typical structural sizes we have for the tuggies are around about half a TCF. Yes, if it's a stratigraphic play, we get up to a couple of TCF, but the 5 TCF plus has got to come from Roger's big features. We've all worked in places which the geology is really difficult. You can see nothing on seismic, and you have to use structural models to actually interpret that. And what you're doing then is, when you've got a big thrust fold belt like this, where you've got your big folds, that's where you get fractures, that's your porosity superhighway. So if you're in Bolivia, that's where you're getting 150 million scuffs a day. That is the knowledge that we can kind of bring to this. But of course, we're some way off. We've got 2 good well locations. It's going to take us until December before we get to the T11 location. But by God, it's really exciting. So thank you very much for coming along. We love talking to you. We love our subject, and we've got another hour's worth of conversation. So enjoy lunch, and we enjoy talking to you. Thank you.